So yesterday we were learning about the elements of fiction, and what we were focusing on is really the pieces that an author puts together to create the plot of a story. And reminder that plot is the action in a story, the events in a story. So we learned about exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. But today we're going to learn about some other essential elements of fiction, and those are characters and conflict. In my opinion, those are the most important elements of a story, because if you don't have well developed characters and you don't have a well developed conflict, you really don't have a story. Or you may have a story, but you really just don't have an interesting story that people would want to be reading. So we just watched the Pixar short film Glued. And in that story, I think it's a great example of the different types of characters and the different types of conflict. So we're going to use that story today to analyze and learn a little bit more about the different types of characters as well as the different types of conflict. So specifically, there are a variety of different characters that an author may include in the story, and they include them for very different purposes. Those characters are usually called round or dynamic characters, or they're called flat or static characters. Your round or dynamic characters tend to be your main characters. They may even be the characters that are driving or telling the story if the story is told in the first person point of view. They are the characters that you really tend to know a lot about. Usually a story, if it's a short story, may have two or three. If you're reading a novel or a longer historical fiction or something along those lines, you may have even more than that. However, there are also a number of other characters, secondary characters, that are known as flat or static characters. And these characters tend to be characters that are involved in the action, are involved in the conflict, but they really are not the characters who are driving the story. They're not the characters who are changing the direction of where the story goes. They're really there just as an individual that's adding a little bit to the story. Okay, so when we're talking about this, understanding the many different types of characters can help us to better understand what we're reading. So when we're talking about a round characters are referring to characters that we know a lot about. We know what they believe, we know what they think, we know what's motivating them, we know how they feel about the other characters, we know where they live. We tend to know a lot about them, and their feelings, actions, thoughts, and speech tend to be what drives or changes the story as we go along. And throughout the story, they also tend to be the individuals who are experiencing the conflict, and they're experiencing an internal change. We're going to learn about notice and note signposts, and one of the things that we will learn about contrasts and contradictions, which is essentially when a character changes throughout a story. So the most defining characteristic of a round or dynamic character is that the character changes in some way throughout the story. If the character is the same at the beginning of the story as they are at the end of the story, then you really don't have a round or dynamic character. Rather, you're going to have a flat or a static character. So in this case, flat characters refer to characters that we don't know a lot about them. They don't talk a lot, they don't say a lot, we don't know a lot about their motivations, we don't know a lot about their backstories, and they're really definitely not impacting our plot. They're not changing the way the story is evolving or developing in any way. And they're sort of always in the background. So static or flat characters don't experience much change in the story. They tend to be the same person at the beginning story as they are at the end. Don't mind my dogs who want to add a little bit of thoughts to our screencastify today, if you will. So then I want to look today, the other thing I want to look at, because I think this is a great story to do that with, is conflict. Okay, so essentially now that you know the elements of a plot diagram, in an exposition, in the beginning of the story is really where we get introduced to the conflict and the character. It's really where we start to learn about those two elements of the story. And then the rising action is really where the author is starting to get the reader to know the characters a bit more and getting them familiar with the characters and what makes them tick and how they think, how they act, how they feel. but it's really also where the author is really starting to build that conflict, is really starting to get that conflict going. Whatever the conflict is what drives your story. It's whatever needs to be solved. And there are many different types of conflict. So there can be what I like to refer to as an internal conflict, which is a character versus themselves. So when a character is fighting or struggling or really trying to make a decision about something and battling about something in their own life and making a decision with that, there tends to be an internal conflict. The most common type of conflict you're going to experience is a character versus character. So when two different people want two different things. So think about in your life, anytime that you and maybe one of your siblings want something different, right? And the tension and the anger, maybe there's yelling happening, maybe there's one character trying to push what they want forward and another person is not doing that. Okay, character versus character, anytime two different characters want two different things, you're going to have conflict. And conflict is going to change the way the story plays out. One character is usually going to win, another character loses, maybe there's another character who pushes in with what they want, the character may change a little bit. But character versus character is a very common type of conflict. You can also have character versus environment. So character versus environment can be a challenge that the character is encountering in the world around them. These tend to be stories that have really well-developed settings. So if you guys were reading the I Survive series, those tend to have really developed character versus setting or character versus environment conflicts. So in this case, you're really going to have the environment that the character or setting that the character's in really changing the story. So if you can't say that the setting is changing the story, then you don't have a character versus environment story. And character versus society. So this is where the character is fighting with a larger group, community, or culture. So this is where you've got one individual kind of fighting everyone. I don't know if you've read The Hunger Games, but The Hunger Games is the story that I think of every time I think of this, where you've got that one character, Katniss Everdeen, and she is kind of fighting against the way society has been structured and the unfair ways that it's been set up. So you're really thinking of one character who is trying to change something with a whole group of characters. Now, when you're looking at conflict, what's really important for you to notice is that very often in a story, you have many different types of conflicts happening at the same time. Each individual character can have their own conflict, and then you can have one central conflict that's sort of driving the story. So when we talk about conflicts, and when you talk in just a bit about Glued and you look at the conflicts in there, think about the conflicts that are happening. And conflicts, again, only happen with your round or dynamic characters. They're not going to happen with your static or flat characters because those characters don't change anything. So you want to be thinking about what the conflicts are, but then what you want to be doing is you want to be looking, and we'll be doing this throughout this unit, you really want to be looking at how are the conflicts changing and developing, and then how are the conflicts driving the story? What is happening with the conflict, and then what happens with the plot? Because when you start to realize the relationship between the conflict and the plot, that's when you get to be a really strong reader of fiction. So good readers of fiction pay attention to conflict, and they pay attention to the different layers of conflict. And they notice that when you see different elements of conflict happen, that they predict that there's going to be a change in the plot. And they look for that, and they anticipate that, and they understand that when they're reading. So that's really what separates a mediocre or just okay reader of fiction from a great reader of fiction. And that's ultimately what we're going to really try to do this year in our fiction unit, is really start to be people that can make inferences and predictions around our character motivations and our plot and our conflicts so that we can better understand the stories we're going to read. So let's do a little bit of an analysis of Glued. Let's look and see what kind of characters and conflict we have.